Welcome back to the third and last session in this webinar on deagrarianisation across contexts in South Africa and Europe. So during the first previous sessions, we have had presentations first from research in South Africa and then from Europe in different contexts. And during this last session, we invite all the 7 presenters to discuss together and answer questions from the audience. And Therese, you can stop sharing the PowerPoint. And David, can you switch on your camera? Yes, so I think everyone is here. And we still have some unanswered questions from previously, and they're dropping in new questions as well. But first of all, I wanted to ask if all of you presenters, if you have thoughts or things that you want to share now when you have listened to each other's presentations, if you've thought about similarities or contradictions that you would like to raise. And just wave if you want to say something, or use the raise my hand function. Yes, Paul. Unmute.
I have to unmute. I think Shona made a very interesting comment, where we didn't pay too much attention to, is that deagrarianisation actually also offers opportunities, plenty. And I think we should start sort of thinking from that as well, and not just about what I do, re-agrarianisation, but also the opportunities that are generated through deagrarianisation. I mean, Shona gave the example of let's say, the woody coverage of the field, right? When I started working in Kukuka Colony in the 1995, and you saw these fields, and you were asking, where do you get your firewood from? Oh, from the arable fields. I was flabbergasted. I mean, I couldn't sort of contextualize that particular answer to my question. But it is, people, if you don't use your field, your field changes. It gets a different composition, gets a different quality, as it were, and new resources can be used. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to these kinds of things, not just the dreadful sort of, deagrarianisation means poverty, people, you have no jobs and no future. Of course, the opportunities are not for 100% of the people, but I think we need to look at these kinds of things. The production of firewood, the production of herbs, of grasses. I mean, in Kukuka, there was a white farmer once came and he saw these huge fields, sort of not very much planted, and there was grass, and he started to buy them, right, for his cattle. So it's an opportunity, if you like. And
just in relation to that, I would like to add a question from the audience, from Akinyemi from University of Fort Hare. Any comments on how to reconcile deagrarianisation with the restoration of missing ecological functions using trophic rewilding? Do you have, or does Shona want to comment on this? Cecilia is waving, but yes, Shona, you need to unmute.
I said Cecilia can go, but yeah, I'm not quite 100% sure what the question is asking, but yes, there are new ecological functions that come out of field abandonment. There's often a mix though, because you might get invasive species also coming into those old fields that can become problematic, particularly if they spread, and some of them are also poisonous to cattle. So there's always a trade-off as well between valuable ecosystem services provided by those fields and some that actually might be disservices. But certainly, yeah, I think there was another question. Someone said, what are the perceptions, people's perceptions of the changes in the landscape and these new ecosystem services? And I think Vanessa Masterson's PhD actually looked a little bit around that. But there's still this connection to the land and this connection to the various resources on that land the different types of species on that land. So some people will benefit from actually having access to medicinal plants that might have become quite scarce and people have to walk far for. So we've seen some of that. Obviously, fuel wood has become quite important. So in my longer presentation, I present a case study where youth in one community have actually become door-to-door sellers of fuel wood as a result of a constellation of factors coming together, but including this woody invasion into the old fields. I think people do recognize those other ecosystem services. People say, we're going back to grazing. I was talking to someone from Botswana and they say it's almost cyclical in Botswana. So people in dry periods, people will stop cultivating the land, they let it rest, they start using it for grazing, they harvest other resources from that land, and if you get it back into a wet cycle, they might reactivate that land. But they didn't recognize that it was, we were developing a proposal and I used the term land abandonment. They didn't even recognize that. What do you mean by land abandonment? This is not land abandonment. This is just different uses of our land as we go through different weather and climate cycles. So yeah, I think there is still a recognition of the value of that land for the other services that it provides.
Thank you. And Cecilia?
I just wanted to comment on the fact that in the European setting, there's a discussion on land abandonment and pros and cons when it comes to biodiversity, that you lose some of the biodiversity connected to small-scale farming when small-scale farm disappears, but there can be another gain in biodiversity as there is so little sort of wild land left in many areas, and there's this rewilding movement who hopes to sort of revive the areas in Europe. I think in the long run, all this has to do with the amount of arable land that we need for food consumption and basically the kind of diets we have actually. What it's connected and how we handle, what is the space for rewilding the way we run things today? And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Toulouse. Thanks to Brian and Morel for doing justice to my earlier asked question. I would also like to chip in this question. Brian mentions agricultural industrialization, I suppose. In the recent research that I just concluded in Nigeria, I found that the triple helix model, research institute, industry, government linkage, has a long way to improve agro-industrialization, which is an integral part of the Reagrarianization agenda. But saddening, it's very weak. In most sub-Saharan African countries, do you think this framework, the triple helix, can help achieve reagrarianization if its potential is fully harnessed? It's a long question. In the essence, I think the question is, do you think that collaboration between research institutes, industry, and the government is a good way of achieving increased farming in rural areas? Do you have a comment? Brian?
I have a brief comment. I'm unfamiliar with the concept of triple helix, so perhaps someone else can jump in with a more informed opinion. But one thing I want to say, just again, talking specifically about Ukraine, there aren't extension services for smallholder farmers. I'm pretty sure that extension services, that were designed specifically to help smallholder farmers would probably undoubtedly help them. How realistic, that is politically, that there would be money devoted to that sort of thing, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that, extension devoted to kind of smallholders would help.
I think many of us would agree to that, and my own research and that of others here as well has pointed out that the extension services in South Africa, one of the problems is that the extension services are not directed to smallholder farmers, and they don't take smallholder farmers' current situations and local wants and needs into account very much. Cecilia is waving, and then Paul.
I just want to touch on the triple helix model, and my experience of that in the Swedish setting is that what has been developed has been very focused on specific technologies and productions. It has not been a broad way of addressing issues of agrarian change in a way, but more focused on specific issues. And I think that other kinds of technology has developed from below by farmers. So there are many ways of new technologies coming into farming, and triple helix is one of them.
Paul.
Yeah, but in the Netherlands, I think we don't call it the triple helix, but we call it the research, extension, and farming context, the OVO triangle, right? And that has been basically the machinery that set the modernization and the disconnecting of farming from the natural environment in motion, right? That created basically the basis for all sorts of problems that we are now facing, right? Chemical pollution, genetic erosion, biodiversity loss, and all sorts of things. It set Dutch agriculture on a path of modernization, which created lots of problems. So I'm not so happy with these kinds of triangles, particularly when research comes in and experts and you know, these are usually sort of systems that are disconnected from what's happening locally. Absolutely not. So it's not my pathway.
My experience from also from literature using the concept of the triple helix is that it's very technology focused. And I don't want to say that there is anything wrong with new technology, but sometimes the focus on the technology takes focus away from the local context or what farmers actually need. And I think that relates to what Cecilia said also, that these kinds of research industry, government, for example, linkages might work if the starting point is what farmers want and what they can use in their contexts and what they need. But often that's not the situation, and that's the main problem, that they don't work, I think. Vanessa Masterson has posted a link to her thesis in the chat as well, for those who are interested to read more about local meaning and experiences of agrarian change in the former Transkei. So have a look there if you want to read more about that. Now we have so many different questions, so I don't know where to start, but one question that we failed to cover earlier was about land tenure and land tenure security. I think none of you addressed that in your talks, but it's a question that is often raised otherwise when you talk about agriculture development and rural development and so on, and rural poverty. So do you want to comment from your different contexts about the role of land tenure security in your respective contexts? I can start then, if no one is saying anything. From the places where I have done research in the Eastern Cape, my sense is that although people don't have any formal land tenure security, in that part of the Eastern Cape, they seem to feel very secure about their land anyway. And they're not worried about that someone will take their field even if no one is, even if they haven't been using it for decades. But I know it's different in some other parts, also in South Africa. But I feel that in some other research from other places sometimes emphasize land tenure security a lot, and that if there was only secure tenure, everyone would farm productively and that would be the solution. And I'm a bit skeptical to that. So Shiona wants to say something, and then Brian.
Yeah, just to say, the situation in the places I've worked is the same, Clara. So people have fairly secure informal tenure over those fields. But in some ways, because I think it's not formalized, is that people are not willing to let anybody else use those fields, even if they haven't been used for a long time. So fine for grazing. But sometimes what Paul and I found, there's a few farmers who'd really like to expand their production, but don't have the land to do that. And because there isn't secure tenure around those fields, people are not willing to kind of lend them out. We did pick up some exchanges in return for cattle and things like that in the work, but I think most people that land is still precious to them and they still hang on to it even if they're not using it. And because they have no real security over it, they're not willing to let someone else use it.
Thank you. So I want to let David in, then Brian, then Paul. David, unmute, yes.
I mean, I think there are a whole lot of really critical questions around regimes of land tenure, and I think it's helpful to reflect that there's often there's sort of a mismatch, or there's a kind of disconnect between what happens on the ground and practices on the ground and the sort of larger political machinations. So I know South Africa quite well, and I think if one looks at it in terms of big picture, there's this increased tendency by the state to strengthen the hand of traditional authorities and chieftaincy. So I think there's part of a larger kind of political move to sort of playing to traditional leaders, and I think that, I mean, that's potentially I think problematic for individual household sort of land rights. I mean, there are alternatives. The forms the experts on this that talk about forms of social and communal tenure, but I fear that there's often this tendency. It's evident in South Africa, but in fact, in many sort of post-colonial African states, there's often this this tendency to try to placate traditional authorities or the chieftaincy, and often to shore up support in rural areas, and I think it can be quite problematic. And in South Africa, we've seen it sort of directly implicated in essentially land grabs. I mean, the former Transkei around Holobeni, Australian mining capital wanting to strip mine coastal dunes, titanium, and it's been a source of massive contestation, and including a very strong sort of perspective, I think, from people on the ground that that they hadn't been consulted, and in fact there was a successful constitutional court finding that aspects of the process were quite problematic. So I think, I think there's sort of larger political dynamics around pandering or putting a lot of emphasis on traditional customary authorities and institutions, and I think it's often to the detriment of people on the ground. I think there's also, and sorry, I know I'm going on a bit, I'll try and keep it concise. I think there's also the sort of lingering appeal of private tenure. You know, this is the De Soto-esque idea of, we just have to give people private title and, you know, they'll invest in land and they'll, you know, you'll have vibrant land markets. And I think there are a whole lot of critical voices around that too. I think sort of privatized individual title is also highly problematic in many respects. It often sort of increases rural social differentiation. It means the powerful get more and the less powerful become dispossessed. So I think tenure can be, I think, quite a sort of fraught issue. And perhaps I'll round off by just referring to some of Phil Woodhouse's work on vernacular land markets and the way in which, even in the absence of tenure, you do get land in communal areas being rented out and transacted informally. So I think there often are practices on the ground that we sort of not aware of, and that particularly policymakers who can be, I think, unduly influenced by, by the appeal of private tenure, they tend to sort of be totally inattentive to those. That's the long answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So we move on to Brian and then Paul.
I'll be speaking from the Ukrainian context, but I think I'll be kind of reinforcing what David Neves was just talking about. I don't think you can say, I don't think anyone would describe, any landowner in Ukraine would describe their sort of tenure as particularly secure. You have a real big disparity in power between these sort of giant agro corporations and these landowners. But And then this whole thing about farmland sales that is coming next year. I mean, it's kind of very much motivated by this DeSoto kind of discourse that this is going to, make the owner of the land relate to their land and use their land in a much more sort of rational kind of sustainable fashion. And I think that those, I'm skeptical of those claims. But the other thing that's interesting about Eastern Europe or Ukraine or particularly Russia. So, I wouldn't describe sort of village landowners as having security of tenure, but I wouldn't describe many of these giant agro companies as having especially secure tenure either. You have a lot of cases, with all these machinations and corruption and rigged court cases where companies lose their or oligarchs lose their property. So that's, I don't think anyone has secure tenure. But I guess probably, I'd rather be, say, an oligarch in the situation, but even they don't have secure tenure.
Thank you. And Paul?
Just to clarify, I think we need to be very careful about the context we are talking about. I mean, in the villages where I work, the people have quit rent title deeds, right? Quit rent is some sort of, it's almost a private title deed, right? That people do have title deeds. They show you their title deeds given out by the Queen in 1800 something. They still have these, and they're still in King William's down in the deeds registry, right? And if you look at the practices of land, people don't care about that, the fact that they have a title deed or not, right? But as soon as you start discussing the opportunity that the value of land increases, then they started playing out, this is my land, don't go, don't set a foot on it, right? But as soon as you don't talk about improvement of land, we for instance, 5 years ago, we started throwing around ideas of irrigation, right? Some of the fields are close to the river and they're nicely flat and they're ideal for irrigation. So from a technical point of view, you can ideally water the field and actually start growing maize and actually reduce the environmental risk to grow maize or any other crop, right? But as soon as we started talking about that we wanted basically to rent the land and set up a few youngsters, young people in the village who were very keen on working with us on experimenting with the irrigation, the older generation who owns the title deed says, no, this is our land, right? And they gave it up and they didn't want even to think about sort of exchanging that land in exchange for, let's say, a few hundred rand a year or so. And now they don't get anything, not even the grass, they don't do anything with the land. So it is very complicated. So we need to be very wary about the context and about the history and about actually what happened to that land and to whom it belongs. So it's not an easy question, tenure. I mean, like Fiona was arguing, the communal tenure, and I come across that in Zimbabwe, provides some sort of security, right? But as soon as somebody tries to put a hand on it, whether it's an Australian mining company or whether it's a group of guys from Fort Hare that comes by and want to build an irrigation scheme, then the value of land suddenly changes. I think we need to be aware of that kind of mechanization or that sort of imagination of land for people, that it's not just an economic resource, that it is probably a lot more, right? We all know that. So we have to be very careful with land, and privatizing it will not solve the problem, I guess.
Thank you. Ildiko, did you wave?
Sorry?
No, I'm talking to Ildiko.
Oh.
Yeah, and you need to unmute, Ildiko.
The wrong place. So, yeah, I had just a little reflection on the East European or the Hungarian case, and how it partly has similarities with the Ukrainian, but still differences, and it's how this cooperative land mass was dissolved, and about 2/3 of the land was distributed to individual owners who got the land in a compensation process. And that is kind of the base for the family farming that is revitalized after communism. But then 1/3 of the land was never given back in physical land. One got a land title, but the land remained in a joint undivided property. So one had a kind of, one received an estimate, an ideal estimate about, I have a hectare land, or I have 5 hectares land in a big undivided property. So that was the base in Hungary for the continued possibility for corporate industrialized agriculture. In this land privatization, all land got titles, so very little land remained in municipal ownership. And that is partly a problem with those who are totally pressed to the out of agriculture and out of labor, that there is a little land in the hand of municipalities to create larger possibilities to work on. Yeah, that was just a little comment too.
Thank you. I know Paul has waved, but Shiona was before, I think. So first Shiona and then Paul.
I don't know if you still want to, if you want to take a different topic, but just still on the same topic. One of the areas I worked in the Cat River Valley, former SIANI, very complicated in terms of tenure. So there was some long-term leasing, there was some ownership in the area, there was some communal land in the area. And basically the work we did there, you know, every time we went there, people would point out and say, that used to be all fields there. It used to be all cabbage, because it's right on a river where they had irrigation. And basically, no one was cultivating because no one was willing to sort out the land tenure, you know, issues. So we even got the Legal Resources Center, which is a law support unit attached to Rhodes University, to try and help go back in time and try and sort out these land rights and tenure issues. And even that didn't get very far. And so the result is there's basically stagnation to some extent. Everyone wants to cultivate, but no one's prepared to start because they're worried about who might else take that land. So yeah, it was quite an entrenched issue, and it was all around tenure.
Thank you. Now I will let Paul in soon. I just want to say we have another 7 minutes for discussion. We don't have any new questions in the question and answer, but I have plenty of questions here in case we run out of topics to discuss. But Paul, you can go ahead.
I just want to say I've been working with a couple of lawyers in Namibia on issues of ancestral land rights and sort of studying court cases, and they are also engaged in these court cases and supporting these ancestral land claims. But one of the biggest problems is that there are different understandings of property, and they say the modern law, common law that you find in a court and where lawyers are being taught is one understanding of property, and customary there's a totally different understanding of property, different claims, different layers of property. I think we need to take that into account when you start discussing land tenure and the conflicts around tenure and about landed property, basically. That complicates it. And it's a political question, because the court cases all end up to be a political court case, right? Whose laws are counting? Those of the lawyers, those of the state, those of the judges, or those of the people that actually want to return, want their land back, right? And that is always the political problem, and the judges are always looking very carefully at the political scenery, right, and the political networks around them, and that creates more problems and more contestations and actually more court cases. So it's an endless thing. But we need to realize that property has different layers, different understanding. Legal anthropology is a very powerful kind of anthropological tradition in this field. Anyway.
Thank you. Flora has waved, and I think Brian also waved. Yeah. Flora.
Thank you. Well, this is introducing a new topic then, which I hope is okay.
Yes.
But you asked before us to reflect across the cases. And as Cecilia mentioned, I was part of our project here in Sweden after researching for several decades in South Africa. And even though these are very different contexts, I could see some similar processes, which were that the sort of capitalist system stress the small-scale farmers in South Africa who cannot compete with the large-scale farms producing their crops in very different, under very different circumstances, and very much better conditions. But the same system really stresses the farmers in Sweden as well, and they cannot compete on the world market, and they feel that they have more difficult circumstances producing crops in Sweden than maybe in other EU countries and so on, both climatic challenges, but also like harder restrictions on animal welfare and different things, high costs of different things, high cost of labor in Sweden and so on. So while they all sort of feel the same type of stress, they are also given similar advice to just invest, take loans, plant high-yielding crops, invest in new technology, very expensive technology. And this advice is not really working out for the majority, both in Sweden and in South Africa. And I think that's because that advice is really attuned to the very best lands and very optimal circumstances. And we have a lot of agriculture going on other lands than the very best lands. So I think this was a similarity that I could see across the two contexts, that we don't acknowledge that people have lands that are not optimal for agriculture, that they are still practicing agriculture on. And I would like to hear other panelists if they're interested to reflect on that.
And in relation to that, I also just want to point out that I can't remember now if it was in your short talk, Cecilia, or in the longer one on the SIANI website, but you also you say that you want to situate Sweden's agriculture in a broader food regime. And I'm thinking that we cannot also forget the supermarkets and the rest of the value chain, because there's so much talk about what farmers can do to improve their situation, but a big problem for farmers is that both in South Africa, I think, and definitely in Sweden, that supermarkets are take a very big share of the money in the food value chain and have a lot of power over farmers. But now we move on to Brian, and then Cecilia has waved as well. And I think after Cecilia, probably the time will be up.
No, move on from me. I had something to a previous comment, so.
Okay, so Cecilia.
I want to connect to what Flora said, that the advisory system in Sweden, as I said, the public one was dismantled in the 1980s. So now people pay for advice, and then of course it's the people it's the well-educated farmers who are tilling on the very productive land that actually use advisory services most. The only publicly funded advisory services you have is a few meetings if you want to transform your farm to organic farming, and also about handling phosphorus and nitrogen. Those are the only public advice you can get. So no wonder it's all sort of adapted to the conventional sort of farmers, as Flora mentions.
And that's also part of a global trend.
Yeah, it's also and I think, Paul, you mentioned this, that farmers try to find value-added ways and building new alternative food networks and things like that to go into other relations with consumers. And we see that, of course, in Sweden as well as all over Europe. But I thought about this land tenure. Of course, we don't have the same problem in Sweden, but what is a problem is for young people who want to go into farming who don't have a farming background, how to get hold of land, because it's very expensive and you don't have to eat the entries into farming.
I mean, one of the, if I may interrupt a little bit, one of the interesting elements of this value adding, which Cecilia talked about, is that, you know, I published a book on with my colleague van der Ploeg about nested markets, right? And the evidence that we have collected in Brazil, but also in Tanzania, in the Netherlands, and probably also in Sweden, is that so-called these local networks. Very typical is that 50–60% of the value that consumers pay in the city is actually coming back to the farmer as income. We found that also in Tanzania, where we retraced, Mark Wegerev and I retraced the maize price, you know, that people pay in the townships in Dar es Salaam back to the producer, and 50–60% ends up with the producer. So these are the markets that people are very much interested in, and this is the kind of agriculture that makes sort of re-agrarianization, let's say, a lively process. And I think, and that's where the policy actually misses out completely. You know, again, agri-parks is about basically giving away your added value, right? While you want to add value back into the village, right? So it's the opposite direction. So nested markets is the solution. And tenure.
Yes, Fiona.
So maybe just again to change the topic and a look at some commonalities. So I was really interested in what Ildiko was saying about the public works program orientated around gardening and agriculture in Hungary. Whereas we have a public works program here that really deals with ecological restoration primarily, whether it's wetlands or mountains or coasts. But I was just thinking, you know, the importance of small-scale food gardening, I think, in the rural areas of South Africa, if this is not something we should alert our policymakers to, because I thought it was a really interesting example. And given that we've got an existing public works program and we've seen already the consequences of widespread hunger as a result of COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. So I'd be really interested to know a bit more about that, and maybe other South Africans who know about the Working For programs, Working for Water, Working for Woodlands, Working for Coasts, Working for Fire, if this is not another potential type of public works program. So that was just something that I picked up that I found very interesting. Thank you.
I don't know if we have time for comment or
Yes, yeah.
We're out of time. Yeah, I mean the big dilemma with this Hungarian experience is the kind of framing of this program, which is building on very heavy dependencies on the local power holders of welfare state to get these jobs, and that public work is not equivalent with a main employment. So it's very restricted rights attached with it. So it is a very authoritarian frame. But on the other hand, one needs to differentiate between the state and the local practices. And if one looks into local practices, then one finds many positive examples, which could be I mean, there is a big variation of what one makes out of this possibility, and there are examples of focusing on also incorporating and revitalizing this small-scale household production as part of the public work agenda. And what is required is a kind of more participatory approach to it, and to make, as it was in the state socialist period, the cooperatives were integrating small-scale producers. So as it is with the farmers now in relation to the supermarkets, so they are in total dependency. I studied also family farming, the return to family farming after the fall of socialism, and to start with, the supermarket chains came to the farmers to collect the goods, and now it is this just-in-time method that they bring in the middle, late night or early morning, come with this and this and that, and that makes it impossible for small producers to deliver. So one would need some kind of intermediary institutions that could help also those who would like to engage with also marketing of products. So that's, I think, would be the way to make use of this public work project.
Thank you very much, Ildiko. We have to start to finish. We have to begin to run this off. There was a last question from Walter Musaka that we didn't have time to cover now, but we can take it with us. The question is, what do you call a situation when people are migrating, some leaving farming to alternative livelihoods? However, few farmers remaining or expanding their land, consuming pristine forests and grassland to expand cultivation. I think you shouldn't answer this question now because we don't have time, but I think that this Walter's question points to that deagrarianization looks very different in different contexts, and from the recent data I looked at, also the large-scale farming in South Africa is going down in numbers a lot. And I assume that means that the large farms are upscaling, which is also what has happened in Sweden. The deagrarianization in Sweden has been an upscaling, fewer people in farming, but bigger farms. But in the smallholder areas, it has more to do with that people farm less of their household food. I think we can leave Walter's question and take it with us and realize that the discussion on deagrarianization is not finished. And we hope there will be, hopefully, a SASUF meeting in Sweden in November. This webinar was supposed to be a live seminar in Sweden, which was cancelled due to the COVID-19. But it's now rescheduled for November, and hopefully we can continue this discussion in November in some form. So keep your eyes open for that, and we will keep our links with SIANI as well. So we will post information on the SIANI webpage as well as on the SASUF information places. So that was all for today, and the seminar has been recorded, as you know, so you can share it with friends or watch it again if you feel that you need to be reminded. And you can also watch the longer presentations on the SIANI webpage. You can find the link to those presentations earlier in the chat, and maybe if I have contact with Alin now, she can post that link again. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.